3 days after my in-laws called me the help at Thanksgiving dinner, Human Resources stood in a glass conference room and read a hotel room number out loud. The room went so quiet I could hear the air vents above us. My mother-in-law stopped breathing for a second. My father-in-law lowered his eyes. My husband looked at me like he had finally understood that silence can become evidence. And me, the girl they had ordered to carry plates, refill wine glasses, and clean up after them in front of everyone. I sat at the end of that table with my hands folded in my lap, knowing that the number HR had just read was about to ruin the perfect family story they had spent years building. But before I tell you about that room number, before I tell you why it mattered, and before I tell you how the people who laughed at me ended up begging me not to speak, I need to tell you how I got there. Because I was not born into that world of polished silver, private clubs, quiet threats, and family names printed on office doors. I came from a small apartment above a bakery, where the smell of bread came through the floor every morning, and my mother taught me that dignity was something no one could give me, and no one should be allowed to take. My name is Sophie, and for a long time, I believed love could make any room safe. I met Daniel when I was 22. He was not like the men I had grown up around, or at least I did not think he was. He wore pressed shirts, spoke softly, and listened like every word mattered. I was working the front desk at a small legal office while finishing night classes in business administration. He came in one rainy afternoon to drop off documents for his father's company, and he smiled at me like I was not just the girl behind the counter. He asked if I liked coffee, then corrected himself and asked if I had time for coffee, as if my time was something valuable. That small difference meant more to me than it should have. In the beginning, Daniel made me feel chosen. He took me to quiet restaurants where he asked about my dreams. He remembered things I mentioned once. He knew I wanted to work in corporate operations, not just answer phones forever. He told me I was sharp, calm under pressure, and stronger than I knew. When he brought me flowers, they were not roses from a gas station, but white lilies, because I had once said they reminded me of my grandmother's garden. I was young enough to believe attention was the same as devotion. I was lonely enough to believe being seen was the same as being safe. His family entered my life slowly, then all at once. The first time I met them, his mother, Victoria Whitmore, looked me up and down in a way that felt like a cold hand on my back. She smiled, but her eyes did not. His father, Charles, shook my hand as if he was testing whether I knew how to hold one properly. His sister, Caroline, asked where I had gone to school, and when I told her I was still finishing my degree at night, she said that was admirable in the same tone someone might use for a child learning to tie her shoes. Daniel squeezed my knee under the table and whispered later that they were just old-fashioned. Old-fashioned became the word he used for everything that hurt me. When his mother corrected my pronunciation at dinner, she was old-fashioned. When his father asked if my parents had ever owned property, he was old-fashioned. When Caroline joked that I was marrying up before Daniel had even proposed, she was only teasing. I wanted to believe him because loving Daniel meant believing there was a soft place beneath all that coldness. So I smiled more. I dressed better. I read books about etiquette. I learned which fork to use, which wine not to touch, which laugh was too loud, which silence made me look obedient instead of wounded. Daniel proposed after 2 years, under string lights in the courtyard of the first restaurant where he had taken me. I cried before he even opened the ring box. For a moment, I forgot every sharp look his mother had given me. I forgot Caroline's little smiles. I forgot the way his father had once asked Daniel if he was sure he wanted a wife who would need polishing. I saw only Daniel on one knee, telling me I was his home, his peace, his future. I said yes because I believed marriage would make me family. I believed family, once official, could not keep treating me like a guest who had overstayed. Our wedding looked beautiful in pictures. That is the strange thing about pain. It can hide behind flowers, candles, and expensive photography. Victoria chose the venue because she said my taste was sweet but simple. Charles paid for the reception and reminded everyone of it in every speech. Caroline wore champagne even though I had asked the bridesmaids to wear blue. Daniel told me not to let small things ruin a perfect day. So I swallowed the small things until they became heavy stones inside me. When I looked back at the photos later, I could see it in my own face. I was smiling like a girl trying not to disappear. After we married, Daniel brought me closer to the family business. Whitmore Properties was not just a company. It was the family kingdom. They owned hotels, office buildings, and luxury apartment complexes across 3 states. Charles was the chairman. Victoria sat on charity boards connected to every major client. Caroline worked in branding, though everyone knew she spent more time taking credit than doing the work. Daniel was being prepared to step into executive leadership. And me, despite my degree, my experience, and my quiet skill with systems and people, was treated like an accessory Daniel had brought home from a less impressive neighborhood. At first, I told myself I did not need their approval. I had Daniel. I had my own ambitions. I had started working in operations at one of the smaller hotels under a different last name, because I wanted to earn my place without anyone saying I had been handed a title. Only a few people in upper management knew I was Daniel's wife. I liked it that way. I worked hard, learned quickly, and discovered that I was good at seeing what others missed. I noticed scheduling problems, vendor overcharges, staff burnout, quiet patterns and complaints. I did not need a famous name to understand how a business really survived. I only needed to listen to the people everyone else ignored. That was how I first heard about Room 814. It came up in whispers long before Thanksgiving. At the Langford Hotel, one of Whitmore's most profitable properties, employees avoided mentioning it directly. Housekeepers traded looks when certain executives arrived. Front desk staff went tense when private bookings appeared under strange initials. A server once told me that some guests were not really guests, and some meetings were not really meetings. I did not understand at first. I thought it was about billing fraud or hidden client entertainment. Then I found missing records, altered schedules, and complaints that had been closed without investigation. The more I looked, the colder my hands became. I reported what I found through the proper internal channels, using my employee name, not my married name. I sent documents, dates, and screenshots. I asked for a confidential review because several names involved belonged to people connected to the Whitmore family. HR responded slowly, then carefully. They asked me to preserve everything. They told me not to confront anyone. They scheduled a formal meeting for the Monday after Thanksgiving. At the time, I thought the meeting would be about policy violations, maybe financial misconduct. I had no idea that the same people who would humiliate me over turkey and candlelight were already tied to the room number that would expose them. Thanksgiving was held at Victoria and Charles's estate, a stone house with tall windows and a driveway that curved through trees trimmed like they were afraid to grow naturally. Every year, the Whitmores turned the holiday into a performance. There were silver chargers, linen napkins, handwritten place cards, and a floral arrangement so large it blocked half the faces at the table. Guests included relatives, business partners, neighbors, and people Victoria called dear friends, even though she spoke badly about them once they left. I had been there before, but that year felt different. Daniel had been distant for weeks, and whenever I asked why, he said work was complicated. I arrived early because Victoria had asked me to help with a few small things. I should have known better. A few small things became checking the seating chart, arranging the dessert table, steaming napkins, carrying boxes from the pantry, and calling the caterer when one of the warming trays did not work. I was wearing a soft green dress Daniel once said made my eyes look brighter. By noon, my sleeves were damp from the kitchen sink and my hair had loosened from its clip. Victoria passed through the kitchen twice without thanking me. The third time, she handed me an apron and said it would protect my dress. I laughed because I thought she was joking. She was not. She held the apron out between 2 fingers, like the fabric itself embarrassed her. Behind her, Caroline leaned against the doorframe, sipping sparkling water with a slice of lime. She smiled at me and said it was sweet that I knew my way around a kitchen. I looked toward Daniel, who had just walked in holding his phone. He saw the apron. He saw my face. For 1 second, I thought he would say something. Instead, he glanced back at the hallway and told me his mother was under a lot of stress and we should all just help where we could. That was the first crack in me that day. Not because of the apron, not even because of Victoria. It was because Daniel knew. He knew the difference between helping and being placed. He knew the difference between family pitching in and one person being lowered in front of others. But he chose peace with them over protection of me. So I took the apron, not because I accepted what they were doing, but because I wanted to get through the day without causing a scene. That was one of the lies I had been taught by years of polite cruelty. I thought not causing a scene meant I still had control. Guests began arriving around 3. The house filled with perfume, laughter, football sounds from the den, and the soft clink of glasses. I tried to slip upstairs and fix my hair, but Victoria called my name from the dining room. She asked me to refill water glasses before people sat down. I looked around for the catering staff and realized there were only 2 servers for nearly 30 guests. Victoria had planned it that way. She wanted just enough staff to make the evening look formal, but not enough to stop her from using me as the invisible extra pair of hands. Every time I tried to sit, another task appeared. The first time someone called me the help, I thought I had misheard. It was Daniel's uncle Martin, standing near the fireplace with a drink in his hand. He did not know me well, or maybe he knew exactly enough. He snapped his fingers lightly and asked if the help could bring more ice. A few people turned. My face went hot. Before I could respond, Caroline laughed and said I was not exactly the help. I was Daniel's wife, though honestly I was the only one who knew where anything was. The room laughed in that careful way rich people laugh when cruelty is wrapped in charm. Daniel looked uncomfortable, but he still said nothing. I brought the ice. That is the part I am still ashamed to say out loud. I brought it because my body moved before my pride could stop it. I had spent so many years surviving by making myself useful that humiliation felt almost familiar. I told myself it would be worse to refuse. I told myself everyone would forget. But people do not forget when a room gives them permission to lower someone. They follow the permission. They test how far it goes. By the time dinner was served, the joke had settled around me like smoke. Someone asked if I came with the house. Someone else asked Victoria where she found such efficient help. Daniel finally leaned toward me and whispered that I should just ignore them. That whisper hurt worse than the jokes. Ignore them meant endure it quietly. Ignore them meant do not embarrass me by defending yourself. Ignore them meant his comfort still mattered more than my dignity. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a man divided between the wife he claimed to love and the family he was afraid to disappoint. For years, I had mistaken his softness for kindness, but softness without courage is just another kind of weakness. And that night, his weakness left me standing alone in a room full of people who knew exactly what they were doing. Dinner was served in courses because Victoria believed Thanksgiving should feel less like gratitude and more like theater. I was seated near the far end of the table, beside a cousin who spent most of the meal texting. My place card had been set slightly apart from Daniel's, while Caroline sat close enough to him to whisper about business updates with their father. I noticed it then, how the family always arranged space to tell a story. Who sat near power? Who sat near the door? Who was spoken to? Who was spoken around? I was Daniel's wife, but at that table I had been placed like someone temporary. Then Victoria lifted her glass. She gave a speech about family, tradition, loyalty, and the importance of knowing one's place in a legacy. I remember that phrase because she looked at me when she said it. Knowing one's place. Everyone smiled as if wisdom had just been offered. Charles added that the Whitmore name had survived because each generation understood duty. Caroline said some people were born into responsibility and others married near it. Again, laughter. Again, Daniel's silence. I sat with my napkin in my lap, fingers pressed so tightly together that my knuckles ached, and I wondered how many small deaths a person could suffer before anyone noticed she was gone. Halfway through the meal, one of the servers spilled gravy near Victoria's chair. It was a small accident, barely anything, but Victoria's face hardened. Before the young woman could apologize fully, Victoria turned to me and said, "Sophie, please handle that before it stains." Not Daniel. Not Caroline. Not the actual staff member already reaching for a cloth. Me? The table watched as I stood. My chair scraped against the floor louder than it should have. I walked around the table, took the cloth, and knelt beside Victoria's chair to clean the floor while my husband's family continued eating above me. That was when Caroline said it. She said, "Careful, Mother. You are getting too used to having the help around." This time the laughter was not careful. It was open. It rolled down the table, bounced off the crystal glasses, and landed on my back while I knelt there with gravy on my hands. I looked up at Daniel. His face had gone pale, but he did not move. He did not tell them to stop. He did not even say my name. Something inside me became very still. Not calm, not healed. Just still, like a door closing softly in a house no one knew was empty. I stood, folded the cloth, and placed it on the sideboard. My hands were shaking, but my voice was not. I said I needed a moment. Victoria smiled and told me not to be dramatic. Charles sighed as if I had interrupted something important. Caroline tilted her head and asked if I was upset over a joke. Daniel finally reached for my wrist under the table, but by then his touch felt like another request to stay quiet. I pulled away gently. I did not storm out. I did not cry in front of them. I walked to the powder room, locked the door, and stared at myself in the mirror. There are moments when you do not recognize your own reflection, because the person looking back has finally learned something you were trying not to know. My eyes looked older. My lipstick had faded. A strand of hair clung to my cheek. I washed my hands 3 times, but I could still feel the floor under my knees. I wanted to call my mother, but she had passed away the year before, and grief hit me so suddenly I had to grip the sink. She would have told me to come home. She would have said no table was worth kneeling beside if the people sitting at it enjoyed seeing you there. Instead, I opened my phone and saw an email notification from HR. It was a reminder for the confidential review scheduled Monday morning at 9. The subject line looked ordinary, but in that bathroom, it felt like a lifeline. Attached was the meeting location, a conference room at headquarters, and a note asking me to bring any additional documentation related to Langford Hotel Room 814. I read the number again and again. Room 814, the number I had seen on hidden invoices. The number connected to altered schedules. The number tied to executive visits that never appeared in official logs. I did not know yet how close that number was to the people sitting in the dining room. When I returned to the table, no one apologized. In fact, they acted as if my short absence had been the rude part. Daniel whispered that we would talk later. I looked at his plate, still full, his wine untouched, his posture tense but unmoving. I realized he was waiting for the night to pass, waiting for me to absorb the injury so he would not have to confront the people who caused it. I sat down, but something in me had already stood up. I listened more carefully after that. I watched more closely. Pain can sharpen you when you stop begging it to be gentle. Near dessert, Charles and Martin moved into a conversation about the Langford Hotel. They lowered their voices, but I was sitting close enough to catch pieces. Occupancy rates, private client retention, discretion. A board review? Then Caroline mentioned that some records needed to stay clean before the quarterly audit. Victoria cut her eyes toward me and changed the subject with a bright question about pumpkin pie. It was quick, almost invisible. But by then I knew how to read rooms. I had learned from years of being ignored that ignored people hear everything. My stomach tightened, not from fear this time, but from recognition. Daniel drove us home after 9. The car smelled like cold leather and his expensive cologne. For the first 10 minutes, neither of us spoke. I looked out the window at houses glowing with warm lights. Families inside them probably arguing, laughing, cleaning dishes, living ordinary human lives. Finally, Daniel said his family had gone too far. He said it softly, like a confession he hoped would count as action. I asked him why he had not said that at the table. His jaw tightened. He said Thanksgiving was not the time to start a war. I turned to him and asked when exactly my dignity would be worth the inconvenience. He did not answer. That silence told me more than any speech could have. When we got home, he went to the bedroom and loosened his tie like he was the exhausted one. I stayed in the kitchen, still in the green dress Victoria had covered with an apron, and opened my laptop. I downloaded every file again, every screenshot, every schedule change, every invoice linked to Room 81 tier, every complaint that had been closed without action. I copied them to a secure drive. I wrote notes while the humiliation was still fresh enough to keep me awake. I was not planning revenge. I was doing something much more dangerous to people like the Whitmores. I was preserving the truth. The next day, Daniel tried to be gentle. He made coffee and kissed my forehead. He said his mother could be difficult. He said Caroline had always had a sharp tongue. He said his father was under pressure. I listened as he built excuses like a man stacking sandbags against a flood. Then I asked if he knew anything about room 814 at the Langford. His hand froze around his mug. It was only a second, maybe less, but I saw it. He asked why I was bringing work into our marriage. I had not mentioned the hotel name before. I had only said the room number. That was the moment I understood my husband knew more than he had ever admitted. I did not confront him further. Not then. Something in his face warned me that if I pushed too hard, he would warn them. So I smiled in a tired way and said I was just stressed. He accepted that because accepting it was easier than asking why I was suddenly watching him like a stranger. All Saturday, I moved through the house quietly. Daniel took calls in the study with the door closed. Once I passed by and heard him say that Monday needed to be controlled. When he came out, he looked startled to see me in the hallway. I held a basket of laundry like a shield and pretended I had heard nothing. By Sunday evening, the air between us had changed. Daniel was too polite, too careful. He asked what time my meeting was Monday, then pretended he meant a general work meeting. I told him 9. He nodded, and that small nod felt like a message being sent somewhere inside his mind. I slept in the guest room that night, claiming a headache. Really, I wanted a locked door between us. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking of Victoria's smile, Caroline's laugh, Charles's lowered voice, and Daniel's frozen hand around the coffee mug. The family had made one mistake at Thanksgiving. They had thought humiliation would make me smaller. On Monday morning, I dressed simply. Navy trousers, white blouse, low heels, no jewelry except my wedding ring, which suddenly felt less like a promise and more like evidence of how long I had stayed. Daniel offered to drive me. I said no. He kissed my cheek and told me everything would be fine, but his voice carried a warning beneath the tenderness. As I walked to my car, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. The message contained only one line: "Do not mention 814 today." For a moment, the world narrowed to those words on the screen. Then I looked back at the house, where Daniel stood behind the window watching me leave. I drove to headquarters with the message still glowing in my mind. Do not mention 814 today. Whoever had sent it clearly believed fear was enough to stop me. Maybe it had worked before. Maybe other people had looked at a warning like that and decided protecting themselves was safer than exposing the truth. A year earlier, I might have done exactly that. A year earlier, I still believed difficult situations could be solved through patience, compromise, and understanding. But after Thanksgiving, after kneeling on the floor while people laughed and my husband remained silent, something fundamental had changed inside me. I was tired of protecting people who never protected me. The headquarters building rose above downtown like a monument to power. Whitmore Properties occupied the top 12 floors, and every polished surface seemed designed to remind employees who mattered. As I walked through the lobby, I noticed details I had ignored before. Executives moved differently than everyone else. Their badges opened doors others could not access. Their mistakes disappeared more quickly. Their names carried weight. For years, I had accepted that hierarchy as normal. But lately, I had started noticing how often privilege was confused with merit. The people cleaning the building worked harder than most of the people giving orders inside it. I checked in with security and rode the elevator to the 21st floor. The HR conference room was located near the legal department, away from the executive suites. That struck me as significant. If this investigation had been routine, they would have handled it internally months ago. Instead, they had involved outside counsel and moved meetings into neutral territory. Someone inside the company understood that the allegations connected to room 814 were serious enough to require distance from the usual chains of influence. That realization made my pulse quicken. Maybe I was not the only person who had been paying attention. The waiting area outside the conference room was almost empty. A young woman from HR greeted me politely and asked if I wanted coffee or water. Her smile seemed genuine, but there was tension around her eyes. She looked like someone preparing for a difficult day. I chose water and sat near the window. 10 minutes later, 2 attorneys arrived carrying thick folders. Neither worked for Whitmore Properties. Their badges identified them as external investigators. They nodded politely but did not introduce themselves. The atmosphere felt less like a corporate meeting and more like the moments before a trial begins. At exactly 9 o'clock, the conference room door opened. The HR director stepped out and invited everyone inside. I followed the others and immediately noticed the seating arrangement. Name cards had been placed around the table. Mine sat near the center, directly across from the investigators. That surprised me. Normally, employees providing information were seated along the side. Witnesses did not occupy central positions. Participants did. I sat down carefully and glanced around the room. The HR director, 2 external attorneys, a compliance officer, 3 senior HR managers, no members of the Whitmore family. Not yet. The meeting began with formal introductions and a review of confidentiality requirements. Everyone spoke carefully, choosing words that sounded precise enough to survive future scrutiny. Then the lead investigator explained why we were there. Over the previous 18 months, multiple complaints had been filed concerning activities at the Langford Hotel. Several involved inappropriate executive conduct. Others involved altered records, employee retaliation, misuse of company resources, and failures to report incidents through proper channels. Internal reviews had repeatedly stalled. Evidence had disappeared. Witnesses had withdrawn statements. Files had been reassigned without explanation. As she spoke, documents appeared on the screen at the front of the room. Dates, emails, audit reports, security logs. Most were heavily redacted, but I recognized enough details to understand the pattern. This was larger than I had imagined. What I thought might be isolated misconduct appeared connected to a broader effort to protect certain individuals from accountability. The investigator emphasized that the company had recently received additional evidence from multiple sources. Some came from current employees, some came from former employees, some came from anonymous submissions. The volume of information had made a formal investigation unavoidable. Then she turned toward me. She thanked me for preserving records instead of deleting them. That sentence landed harder than I expected. For months, I had worried that I was overreacting. I had questioned my judgment. I had wondered whether the inconsistencies I noticed were innocent mistakes. Hearing someone acknowledge the value of what I had documented felt strangely emotional. Not because I needed praise, but because it confirmed I had not imagined the problem. The investigator asked me to explain how I first encountered the discrepancies. I described scheduling conflicts, altered maintenance logs, irregular expense reports, and complaints that vanished after involving certain executives. For nearly an hour, I answered questions. Nobody interrupted me. Nobody called me dramatic. Nobody suggested I misunderstood what I had seen. Nobody asked whether I was being too sensitive. That alone felt unfamiliar. The investigators listened carefully, occasionally requesting clarification. They compared my records against other evidence already collected. Several times they exchanged looks that suggested my information confirmed conclusions they had already begun forming. As the conversation continued, I noticed something else. Certain names appeared repeatedly. Not all belonged to executives. Some belonged to family members. Others belonged to personal assistants, department heads, and outside consultants. The network seemed wider than anyone outside the investigation likely realized. Around 10:30, the conference room door opened unexpectedly. Everyone looked up. 3 people entered. Charles Whitmore, Caroline Whitmore, Daniel. For a moment, nobody spoke. I had known they would eventually become involved. What I had not expected was the timing. Their arrival transformed the atmosphere immediately. Charles walked in with the confidence of a man accustomed to controlling outcomes. Caroline carried herself like someone entering a social event rather than an investigation. Daniel looked exhausted. His eyes found mine briefly before shifting away. The investigators remained calm, but I noticed several of them sit a little straighter. Charles took his seat without greeting me. That hurt less than it would have a week earlier. Now it simply confirmed what I already knew. The lead investigator welcomed them, and explained that the next phase of the meeting involved individuals whose names had appeared within the collected evidence. Charles responded with practiced politeness. He expressed full confidence in company procedures. He emphasized his commitment to transparency. He thanked everyone for their professionalism. Listening to him, you would have thought he was delivering a keynote speech rather than responding to allegations connected to misconduct. I almost admired the performance. Then the questions began. The investigators asked about executive access privileges. Charles answered smoothly. They asked about private client accommodations. Again, smooth answers. They asked about expense approvals. No hesitation. But when they shifted toward room assignments at the Langford Hotel, subtle cracks appeared. Not obvious ones. Tiny ones. A pause before answering. An unnecessary clarification. A glance toward Daniel. A tightening around Caroline's mouth. People reveal themselves most clearly when they believe nobody notices small details. I had spent years being ignored. I noticed everything. The discussion continued for another 40 minutes. Several documents appeared on the screen. Security records, visitor logs, maintenance requests, internal communications. None seemed dramatic by themselves. Yet together they formed an uncomfortable picture. Certain rooms received unusual treatment. Certain guests bypassed normal procedures. Certain complaints disappeared. The investigators never accused anyone directly. They simply placed facts beside other facts and allowed the pattern to emerge naturally. That was when Caroline made her mistake. Trying to sound helpful, she referenced a specific room. The room number she mentioned was not included in any document currently displayed. The lead investigator looked up immediately. So did one of the attorneys. Caroline seemed to realize her error at the same moment everyone else did. She smiled. She laughed lightly. She said she must have heard the number somewhere. Nobody responded. Silence can be louder than accusations. The meeting paused briefly for lunch. I stepped into the hallway and leaned against a window overlooking the city. My phone buzzed. Daniel. I ignored the call. A minute later, another message appeared. Can we talk privately? I stared at the screen. For years, I would have answered immediately. For years, his discomfort mattered more to me than my own. Now I simply locked the phone and slipped it back into my bag. Whatever Daniel wanted to say could wait. Truth had already waited long enough. When the afternoon session began, the investigators introduced new evidence. Hotel access records, digital key logs, maintenance entries, visitor authorizations. The documents covered nearly 2 years. Thousands of entries. Most appeared ordinary, but investigators are not looking for ordinary things. They look for patterns, and room 814 appeared within those patterns repeatedly. The room had received unusual access requests. Records showed visits by individuals whose names never appeared in official guest files. Maintenance logs were altered. Security reviews were bypassed. Complaints linked to the room disappeared. Expense reports connected to certain visits lacked supporting documentation. The further the presentation continued, the more uncomfortable Charles became. Caroline stopped smiling. Daniel looked physically ill. Then one investigator displayed a timeline. Everything changed. The timeline connected executive visits, employee complaints, deleted reports, and unexplained financial approvals. Separate events suddenly became one story. Not a complete story, but enough of one. Enough to reveal intent, enough to establish patterns, enough to justify deeper examination. I watched Charles carefully. His confidence was gone now. Not completely. Men like Charles rarely lose confidence all at once. But cracks were visible. The kind that appear when someone realizes a situation can no longer be managed through influence alone. Then the lead investigator announced that one final piece of evidence remained. The room grew still. Even the air felt heavier. She explained that a witness had recently provided documentation connecting several individuals to activities previously denied during internal reviews. The documentation included dates, communications, access records, and location data. Most importantly, it included confirmation of meetings that multiple participants had claimed never occurred. Charles folded his hands. Caroline looked down. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. The investigator reached for a folder. She opened it slowly. No dramatic gestures. No raised voice, just quiet professionalism, the most dangerous kind. Then she looked directly at everyone seated around the table. Her gaze moved from Charles to Caroline, from Caroline to Daniel, then finally to me. And she said something I will never forget. We would like to begin by confirming one specific location, a location that appears repeatedly throughout the evidence, a location associated with complaints, private meetings, deleted records, and multiple policy violations. The room remained silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The investigator looked down at the document in front of her. Then she read the number aloud. Room 814. The reaction was immediate. Not dramatic. Not loud. Worse. Charles went completely still. Caroline lost all color. Daniel lowered his head. And for the first time since this investigation began, every person in that conference room understood exactly how important that room number really was. What nobody knew yet was that the next document in the investigator's folder would reveal who had been inside room 814 during the meetings everyone claimed never happened. And one of those names was about to destroy a marriage I had spent years trying to save. The silence after the investigator read room 814 felt different from every other silence I had experienced inside Whitmore Properties. It was not the silence of politeness. It was not the silence of fear. It was the silence that appears when people suddenly realize a lie has reached the end of its life. Nobody rushed to explain anything. Nobody interrupted. Nobody laughed. The room seemed suspended between two versions of reality. The one everyone had been pretending to live in, and the one that was about to emerge whether they wanted it to or not. The investigator allowed the silence to settle before speaking again. She did not seem interested in dramatic moments. She was interested in facts. That made her far more dangerous than anyone who enjoyed confrontation. She opened another folder and projected a series of records onto the screen. Access logs, visitor authorizations, internal messages, timestamps. The information looked ordinary at first glance. Just rows of data, numbers and dates. But I had spent enough time around operational records to know that the most devastating truths often hide inside boring documents. She explained that room 814 had not attracted attention because of a single event. It had attracted attention because of repetition. The same names appeared again and again. The same access patterns. The same deleted reports. The same attempts to bypass standard procedures. Every individual incident could have been explained away. Together, they formed something much harder to dismiss. A pattern. And patterns do not care how important your last name is. Patterns tell stories whether powerful people approve of them or not. One of the attorneys stood and approached the screen. He highlighted several dates spread across 18 months. Then he overlaid executive travel schedules. The room became noticeably colder. Even people not directly implicated seemed uncomfortable. I could feel it. Everyone understood where this was heading. The evidence was moving from possibility toward certainty, from questions toward conclusions, and nobody knew exactly how much information the investigators possessed. Then the attorney asked a simple question. Who approved the restricted access authorizations connected to room 814? The answer appeared on the screen. Daniel Whitmore. My chest tightened. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood. Daniel, my husband. The man who claimed he knew almost nothing about the investigation. The man who acted surprised whenever I mentioned concerns about the Langford. The man who insisted work and family should remain separate. His name appeared repeatedly throughout the authorization records. Not once. Not twice. Dozens of times. The room remained silent as everyone processed the information. I looked at Daniel. He stared at the table. Not angry. Not defensive. Defeated. That expression hurt more than denial would have, because it meant he already knew. The investigator continued. She explained that approving access did not automatically prove misconduct. Many executives possessed authority to authorize special accommodations. The concern was not the approvals themselves. The concern was the pattern surrounding them. Approvals connected to missing records. Missing records connected to deleted complaints. Deleted complaints connected to employees who later left the company. The connections were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Then another name appeared. Caroline. Several meetings associated with Room 814 included communications sent directly through her department. Branding consultations, client relations reviews, hospitality evaluations. The descriptions sounded harmless, yet investigators had already confirmed many of those meetings never involved the purposes listed in company records. Someone had been disguising activities behind official business language. Caroline finally spoke. Her voice sounded strained. She claimed she processed hundreds of requests every month. She suggested mistakes were inevitable. The attorney nodded politely. Then he displayed emails. Specific emails. Emails containing instructions. Emails directing staff not to document certain visitors. Emails requesting records be modified after the fact. The room became even quieter. Caroline stopped speaking. For years, I had watched her dominate conversations. For years, she always seemed to have an answer. Now she looked trapped inside her own evidence. Charles attempted to intervene. He questioned the interpretation of the emails. He argued that context mattered. The attorney agreed. Context always mattered. Then he displayed additional messages, and additional records, and additional confirmations. The context only made everything worse. Each new document removed another possible explanation. Each new record narrowed the space available for denial. Charles leaned back heavily in his chair. The confident chairman who controlled board meetings and multi-million-dollar negotiations suddenly looked much older than I had ever seen him. The investigators paused briefly. Water glasses were refilled. Notes were reviewed. Nobody seemed eager to speak. I glanced toward the window. The city stretched endlessly beyond the glass. People moved through their lives below without any idea that an empire was beginning to fracture 21 floors above them. Then the lead investigator returned to the front of the room. Her expression remained calm, professional, measured. But there was something else now. Certainty. She explained that one critical question remained unresolved. Why had so many employees withdrawn complaints after initially reporting concerns? The company had documented a troubling pattern. Reports were filed. Investigations opened. Then suddenly witnesses changed their stories. Some resigned. Some transferred. Some simply stopped cooperating. The pattern appeared too consistent to be coincidence. The investigators had spent months trying to understand why. Now they believed they had an answer. Another document appeared. A spreadsheet. Names. Dates. Meeting locations. One location appeared repeatedly. Room 814, the room where private conversations occurred shortly after formal complaints were filed. The room where employees met with individuals connected to senior leadership. The room where problems seemed to disappear. A chill moved through me. This was bigger than favoritism, bigger than executive misconduct. Someone had been influencing witnesses. Someone had been protecting powerful people. The lead investigator took a breath. Then she introduced the newest witness. A former employee? A manager who resigned nearly a year earlier. Someone previously considered unreliable because her original complaint had been withdrawn. Recently, she had returned. Recently, she had provided evidence. Recently, she had agreed to testify. The investigator clicked to the next slide. A photograph appeared. I recognized the woman immediately. Her name was Rachel. She had worked at the Langford when I first joined operations. Smart. Competent. Respected. Then suddenly gone. Nobody ever explained why. The company simply moved on. Like it always did. The investigator explained that Rachel had preserved records before leaving. Emails, text messages, meeting notes, voice recordings, documentation she feared nobody would believe. Until now, every person in the room watched silently. Then the investigator played an audio file. The recording quality was imperfect, but the voices were clear enough. A woman describing concerns, a man encouraging discretion, another voice suggesting complaints could damage careers. The conversation lasted only 3 minutes. 3 minutes that changed everything, because I recognized one of the voices. Daniel, my husband. The room seemed to tilt slightly beneath me. Not because I doubted the recording, because I did not. I knew his voice. I knew the rhythm of his speech, the pauses, the phrasing, the way he softened difficult statements. For years, I had associated that voice with safety. Now I heard it participating in something entirely different. Daniel closed his eyes. No denial. No outrage. No challenge. Just silence. The kind of silence people offer when truth arrives before they are ready. I wanted to feel angry. I expected anger. Instead, I felt grief. Deep grief. Because betrayal rarely arrives all at once. It arrives in pieces, and each piece forces you to reconsider memories you once treasured. The investigator stopped the recording. Nobody spoke. Then she revealed the final document. A hotel occupancy report, room 814, specific dates, specific visitors, specific authorizations. The list included executives, consultants, clients, and one additional name, Victoria Whitmore. My mother-in-law. The room reacted immediately. Even the attorneys looked surprised. Until that moment, Victoria had appeared only indirectly throughout the investigation. Now her name sat plainly inside the records. No interpretation required. No assumptions necessary. Just facts. Cold. Simple. Permanent. Charles looked genuinely stunned. For the first time all day, he seemed caught off guard. Caroline stared at the screen. Daniel looked physically sick. And I suddenly remembered something. Thanksgiving. Victoria watching me clean gravy from the floor. Victoria smiling while everyone laughed. Victoria talking about loyalty and knowing your place. She had always acted untouchable, above consequences, above accountability. Now her name occupied the center of an investigation threatening everything she valued. The lead investigator explained that Victoria had not yet been interviewed. Her involvement remained under review. No conclusions had been reached. But the evidence required examination. Corporate language. Careful language. Yet everyone understood what it meant. The walls were closing in. The meeting recessed briefly. People left the room in silence. I remained seated. I needed a moment. The documents. The recording. Daniel. Everything felt unreal. A few minutes later, someone approached quietly. One of the external attorneys. He sat across from me. Not beside me. Across. Respecting distance. Respecting boundaries. He spoke softly. He thanked me again for preserving records. Then he said something unexpected. Without your documentation, this investigation might have failed. I stared at him. Not sure what to say. He explained that multiple employees had noticed problems, but very few had maintained complete records. Most became frightened. Some were pressured. Others convinced themselves it was safer not to know. My evidence connected gaps investigators could not previously bridge. For a moment, I thought about Thanksgiving again. About being called the help. About carrying trays. About being overlooked. Invisible. The irony struck me hard. The people who dismissed me as insignificant had made a critical mistake. Ignored people observe everything. Invisible people hear conversations others overlook. People treated like furniture become experts at reading rooms. The attorney stood and returned to the investigators. I remained alone for another minute. Then my phone vibrated. Daniel. Again. This time a message. Please talk to me before they finish. I stared at the screen. Another message arrived. There are things you don't understand. Then another. I was trying to protect everyone. Protect everyone. I almost laughed. The phrase felt absurd now. Protecting everyone had somehow required humiliating employees. Deleting complaints. Concealing records. Remaining silent while his wife was degraded in front of an entire family. I locked the phone without responding. The afternoon session resumed shortly afterward. Everyone returned to their seats. The atmosphere had changed completely. Nobody looked confident anymore. Nobody looked comfortable. The investigators reviewed procedural next steps. Additional interviews, expanded audits, board notifications, potential disciplinary actions. The language remained professional, but the implications were devastating. Careers would end. Reputations would collapse. Relationships would not survive. Then the lead investigator delivered one final announcement. The board had authorized immediate review of executive leadership responsibilities pending completion of the investigation. Temporary restrictions would be implemented, access privileges suspended, decision-making authority reassigned. Several names appeared on the screen. Charles, Caroline, Daniel. The room froze. Effective immediately. Not next month. Not after deliberation. Immediately. For the first time, real consequences had arrived. Charles looked furious. Caroline appeared terrified. Daniel simply looked broken. The meeting adjourned shortly afterward. People gathered documents slowly. Nobody seemed eager to leave. Nobody seemed eager to stay. As I packed my bag, Daniel approached carefully. He looked older than he had a week earlier, older than he had looked that morning. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he asked if we could talk somewhere private. I studied his face, the face I had once trusted completely, the face I no longer recognized. And for the first time since we met, I realized I was not afraid of losing him. I was afraid of discovering how much of him had already been lost. I nodded once. Not because I was ready to forgive. Not because I believed him. Because there was one question I still needed answered. One question bigger than Room 814, bigger than the investigation, bigger than the company itself. As we walked toward an empty conference room at the end of the hallway, I already knew the answer would change my life. What I did not know was that Daniel's confession would reveal that Thanksgiving had never been about a cruel joke. It had been a warning. Daniel closed the conference room door behind us and stood there for a moment without speaking. The hallway noise disappeared instantly. Through the glass walls, I could see employees moving from office to office, carrying laptops and coffee cups, living ordinary workdays, while my entire life seemed to be unraveling one truth at a time. Daniel looked exhausted. His shoulders sagged. The confidence he used to wear so naturally had vanished. For years, I had imagined this moment differently. I thought if he ever betrayed me, I would be angry. I thought I would demand answers. Instead, I felt strangely calm. I sat across from him and waited. The silence stretched. Then he finally spoke. He said he was sorry. Not the quick apologies people offer when they want a problem to disappear. Not the kind that arrive wrapped in excuses. A different kind. The kind that comes when someone understands the damage is already done. But apologies were no longer enough. Too much had happened. Too many choices had been made. I asked him a simple question. Did you know what they were doing at Thanksgiving? His eyes closed briefly. Then he nodded. The answer hurt even though I expected it. Because expectation does not reduce pain. It only changes its shape. I asked him why. Why allow it? Why sit there while they laughed? Why watch me clean the floor? Why say nothing? Daniel stared at the table for several seconds before answering. Then he told me something I never expected. Thanksgiving was supposed to push me away. At first, I thought I misunderstood. Push me away? He nodded again. His voice shook slightly. He explained that months earlier, internal concerns regarding Room 814 had begun attracting attention. Not enough attention to create a formal investigation yet, but enough to worry certain people. Questions were being asked. Audits were being discussed. Records were becoming harder to control. The Whitmore family understood that if investigators started digging deeply, relationships would become liabilities. And I was one of those liabilities, because unlike them, I actually worked inside operations. I understood systems. I noticed details. And most importantly, I was not fully under their control. I sat very still, listening, trying to process every word. Daniel continued. His parents believed distancing me from the family would reduce risk. If I felt unwelcome enough, perhaps I would leave. If I left voluntarily, I would stop asking questions. Stop noticing patterns. Stop existing close enough to cause problems. At first, I struggled to understand. The explanation sounded absurd, cruel, almost unbelievable. Then I remembered every gathering over the past year. Every small insult. Every exclusion. Every joke. Every reminder that I did not belong. Suddenly, the pattern became visible. What I once interpreted as simple snobbery had become something darker. Deliberate. Strategic? Designed. The realization made my stomach turn. I asked whether Victoria planned Thanksgiving. Daniel nodded. Every detail. The seating arrangement. The staffing shortages. The tasks assigned to me. Even the guest list. The evening had been carefully structured. Not to celebrate family, to isolate me, to remind me repeatedly that I occupied the lowest position in the room. The humiliation was intentional, not spontaneous, not accidental, not thoughtless, intentional. For several seconds I could not speak, because some truths arrived too large to process immediately. I thought about the apron, the comments, the laughter, the gravy on the floor, and suddenly I understood something important. None of it had happened because I was weak. It happened because I was dangerous. Not dangerous in the way powerful people imagine danger. I was dangerous because I paid attention. Dangerous because I documented facts. Dangerous because I could not be completely controlled. Daniel continued speaking. The words seemed to pour out now, years of secrets escaping at once. He admitted knowing about efforts to influence complaints. He admitted authorizing access requests. He admitted remaining silent when records disappeared. But he insisted he never believed things would reach this point. He claimed he convinced himself the problems were temporary, manageable, containable. The same lies people tell themselves whenever convenience becomes more valuable than integrity. I listened without interrupting. Then I asked the question that mattered most. Did you ever intend to tell me the truth? Daniel looked away, and in that moment I had my answer. Because hesitation is sometimes more honest than language. The truth was simple. He would have continued lying if the investigation had never cornered him. Not because he hated me, not because he wanted to hurt me, because honesty threatened his comfort. And comfort had always won. For years, I believed betrayal required cruelty. Now I understood something different. Most betrayals are built from cowardice. The conversation continued for nearly an hour. Daniel answered questions, some willingly, some reluctantly. The more he spoke, the clearer everything became. The Whitmore family had spent years operating under the assumption that influence could solve any problem. Employees could be pressured. Records could be adjusted. Complaints could disappear. Consequences belonged to other people, not them. That belief worked until evidence accumulated faster than influence could erase it. Eventually, reality catches up. It always does. When Daniel finally finished speaking, neither of us had anything left to say. The marriage I thought I had built no longer existed. Maybe it never had. Maybe I had fallen in love with potential, with promises, with the version of Daniel I hoped would eventually emerge. The man sitting across from me was not evil. In some ways, that made everything harder. Evil is simple. Cowardice is complicated. Cowardice looks like kindness until difficult choices appear. Then it reveals itself. I stood slowly. Daniel looked up. His eyes were red. He asked if there was any chance we could fix things. The question hung between us. For a moment, I remembered the man who brought me white lilies. The man who listened carefully during coffee dates. The man who made me believe I mattered. I remembered all of it, and that was exactly why I knew the answer. Because love cannot survive indefinitely without respect, and respect had been absent for too long. I told him I did not know what the future looked like. But I knew what it could not look like. It could not look like silence. It could not look like excuses. It could not look like standing alone while someone who claimed to love me watched. Daniel lowered his head. He understood, perhaps for the first time. We left the conference room separately. As I walked toward the elevators, my phone vibrated again. This time it was not Daniel. It was HR. The board wanted to meet with me. Immediately. I followed the instructions and returned to the executive floor. The atmosphere there felt completely different from the one I remembered. Assistants whispered. Doors remained closed. People avoided eye contact. News travels quickly inside corporations, especially when powerful people begin falling. The board meeting took place in a large room overlooking the city skyline. Several directors sat around the table. Most were older, experienced, careful. They thanked me for my cooperation. Then they explained something surprising. The investigation had exposed significant weaknesses inside company oversight systems. Changes would be necessary. Major changes, independent reviews, leadership restructuring, operational reforms, and because my documentation had played a critical role in uncovering the problems, they wanted my perspective. Not as Daniel's wife, not as an outsider, as a professional For a moment, I struggled to process the difference. Years of being dismissed had conditioned me to expect skepticism. Instead, people were listening. Really listening. The discussion lasted nearly 2 hours. They asked questions about employee culture, reporting systems, operational risks. In the end, I learned that the greatest mistake people can make is believing that kindness is weakness and silence means blindness. The same family who called me the help at Thanksgiving never imagined that the person they humiliated would be the one who exposed the truth they worked so hard to hide. Losing their approval hurt, but finding my own strength changed my life forever. Sometimes the people who try hardest to make you feel small are afraid of what you will become once you realize your worth. If you made it all the way to the end of this story, leave a comment below saying I know my worth so I can see who stayed until the very last moment. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next story.